The rope was already around her wrists when Vance Calloway stepped out of the crowd. Nobody expected it. Nobody ever expected anything from Vance Calloway because Vance Calloway did not speak. Not at town meetings, not at the saloon, not even when Earl Denton had cheated him out of 40 head of cattle 2 summers past, and every man in Redemption, Texas, knew it. Vance Calloway paid his taxes, worked his land, and kept his silence like it was the most valuable thing he owned. But he stepped forward now, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for stone, because there was something about the way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, absolutely certain, that told every man and woman present that the next few seconds were going to matter. The girl on the platform was shaking. Vera Arden had been dragged from the boarding house at dawn, still wearing her traveling dress, her dark hair loose and wild around her face, her wrists bound with rough rope that had already begun to leave marks on her skin. Sheriff Harlan Boyce stood beside her with his chest puffed out and his badge catching the morning sun, reading from a piece of paper that listed charges Vera had never heard before in her life. Theft, conspiracy, association with known criminals. The words fell like stones into still water, and the crowd around the wooden platform murmured and shifted, uncertain, hungry in the way that frightened crowds always become hungry when someone gives them a reason. Vance stopped at the foot of the platform steps. He was not a large man in the obvious sense, not barrel-chested like the Denton brothers, not flashy like the men who rode in from Abilene with silver on their gun belts. He was lean and weathered, somewhere in his early 30s, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes that had seen too much too young. He wore no gun today, which was the detail that made the sheriff hesitate. A man without a weapon who was not afraid was a man the sheriff did not have a ready answer for. Vance looked at Vera. She looked back at him. They had never spoken. They had seen each other exactly twice. Once when she arrived on the stage 3 days ago, and once when she walked past the feed store and their eyes met for half a second before she looked away. But he looked at her now with something that was not pity and not calculation, and not the cold measuring look that every other man in Redemption had given her since she arrived. He looked at her like she was a person. Then he turned to face the crowd, and the crowd went absolutely silent. "She is under my protection," Vance Calloway said. Those were the first words Vance Calloway had spoken in public in 3 years. They hit the square like a thunderclap. 3 days earlier, the stage from San Antonio had rolled into Redemption on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1878, raising a red dust cloud that drifted slowly over the main street and settled on everything like a judgment. Vera Arden stepped down from the coach with a small leather trunk, a worn carpet bag, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single long journey but from a life spent in motion. She was 24 years old. She had brown eyes that tended toward gold in certain light, and a face that people remembered without being entirely sure why, not conventionally pretty in the way that men in saloons talked about pretty, but striking in a way that had more to do with intelligence and some deep, private sorrow she carried so naturally that it had become part of her posture. She had come to Redemption because her father had written her a letter 6 months before his death telling her that he owned land here. A small parcel, legally purchased 20 years ago when he was young and hopeful, and had not yet become the man he eventually became. The letter had been delayed. It had gone to 3 wrong addresses before finding her in San Antonio, and by the time it reached her, her father was already in the ground. But the land was real. She had the deed in her carpet bag, pressed between the pages of a Bible she had carried since she was 12 years old. The land deed was the only inheritance she had ever received from Robert Arden, who had been a traveling salesman for most of her life, absent for most of her childhood, and dead of fever at 58 before he could do any of the things he had promised in that letter. She did not grieve him the way daughters were supposed to grieve fathers, because she had not known him well enough to miss him specifically. She grieved the idea of him, the possibility of him, the father he might have become if he had been a different man. She grieved that letter, full of plans and apologies and the particular desperate hope of a man who knows he is running out of time. So she came to Redemption to claim the land, sell it if she must, and figure out what came next. She did not expect to arrive and discover that someone had already built a small house on that land, or that that house was currently occupied by a man named Dale Prout, who had documents of his own falsified documents. She would later learn, but she did not know that yet, claiming the land as his. Or that Dale Prout was the nephew of Sheriff Harlan Boyce, which meant that in Redemption, Texas, Dale Prout's claim was the only claim that mattered. She had gone to the sheriff's office the morning after she arrived. She had laid the deed on his desk. Harlan Boyce had looked at it for a long time without touching it. And then he had looked at her with the specific expression that men in positions of small power reserve for women, who do not understand their place in the order of things. "This deed," he said slowly, "appears to be connected to a property that was the subject of a legal dispute last year. You might want to talk to a lawyer before you make any claims, Miss Arden." There were no lawyers in Redemption. The nearest one was in Waco, 2 days' ride away. Harlan Boyce knew this perfectly well. "I have the original deed," Vera said, keeping her voice level, keeping her hand still in her lap because she had learned young that the moment a woman showed emotion in a room with an armed man, she lost whatever ground she had. "Signed by the county land office in 1858. My father, Robert Arden, purchased that parcel legally." "Robert Arden is dead," Boyce said, "which is why the land passed to me. I am his only living heir." "Can you prove that?" She had brought documents. A copy of her father's death record from the San Antonio courthouse. A letter from the land office confirming the original purchase. Her own birth certificate, which listed Robert Arden as her father. She had brought everything because she had known, with the particular instinct of a woman who has navigated difficult men all her life, that she was going to need to prove everything. Boyce had looked at each document and handed them back without comment. Then he had leaned back in his chair and said, "I'll need to look into this. Come back in a week." She had understood then that she was in trouble. Not because of anything specific he said, but because of the particular quality of his dismissal. Thorough, comfortable, the dismissal of a man who already knew how the story ended. She had gone back to the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Clara Holt, who was kind in a guarded way and had given Vera the room at the top of the stairs with the window that overlooked the main street. Vera had sat at that window for a long time watching Redemption go about its day, trying to figure out her next move. That was when she had seen the rancher. He was riding in from the north on a dark horse, a lean man in a worn coat, and there was something about the way he moved through the street, nodding to people without stopping, accepted without being embraced, that made her look at him for longer than she meant to. He glanced up at her window and she looked away quickly, embarrassed in a way she could not entirely explain. She asked Mrs. Holt about him that evening at supper. "That would be Vance Calloway," Mrs. Holt said, in a tone that was complicated in ways Vera did not yet have the context to understand. "He runs the Calloway Ranch north of town. Good land, about 800 acres of it. His family has been here longer than most." She paused. "He is a quiet man. He seems well regarded," Vera offered. Mrs. Holt considered this. Respected is the word I would use. People here respect him, but they also give him room. He has had some troubles. Vera did not press. She had her own troubles to think about. But she thought about him that night anyway, lying in the narrow boarding house bed listening to the wind come down off the prairie, turning over the quality of that glance. Not rude, not measuring, simply present in a way that most people's glances were not. The next day, she had gone to the land office to request a copy of any recent claims filed against her father's parcel, which was her legal right. The clerk, a young man named Edgar Price who was visibly nervous, had told her there were no records available for that particular parcel. When she asked to see the records directly, he had told her the filing cabinet was locked and he did not have the key. She had stood in the land office doorway and looked back at Edgar Price for a long moment, and the young man had the grace to look ashamed of himself, which told her everything she needed to know. The records existed. They were accessible. Someone had told Edgar Price to keep them from her. She walked back toward the boarding house, turning over her options, and that was when Dale Prout fell into step beside her. He was a large man in his middle 30s, with a broad, genial face that she immediately distrusted because the geniality did not reach his eyes. He introduced himself, told her he was sorry about her confusion, told her the land had been tied up in disputes for years, and it was a shame she had come all this way on account of a misunderstanding. His voice was warm and reasonable, and he put his hand on her elbow as he spoke, which she stepped away from with a precision that made his eyes go flat for just a moment before the warmth came back. "I think," he said, still smiling, "that you and I could probably come to some kind of arrangement that would suit you just fine. You came here wanting to sell that land anyway, didn't you?" "I came here to understand what I own," she said. "You don't own anything yet," he said pleasantly. And redemption can be a difficult place for a woman traveling alone. You might want to think about making friends while you're here. She had understood then that the veiled threat was not veiled at all. It was a warning delivered with a smile, and the smile was the worst part of it. She had gone back to the boarding house and sat with Mrs. Holt in the kitchen and told her everything, because she needed to tell someone, and because Mrs. Holt, despite her guarded kindness, had the look of a woman who knew what it meant to be cornered by powerful men in a small town. Mrs. Holt had listened without interrupting, her hand still around her coffee cup. When Vera finished, the older woman was quiet for a long moment. "Harlan Boyce has run this town his way for 15 years, Mrs. Holt said finally. "Dale Prout does what Harlan tells him, and Harlan keeps him out of trouble in return. Between the two of them, they have taken 3 properties in the last 5 years. Always legal on the surface. Always from people who were not from here, who did not have anyone to speak for them." "Is there nothing to be done?" Vera asked. Mrs. Holt looked at her with a kind of worn-out courage. "There might be," she said, "if the right person were willing to stand up, but that is a hard thing to ask of anyone in this town." Vera had gone to bed that night with the deed pressed under her pillow, and a knot in her chest that she recognized as fear. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the cold, grinding fear of injustice. The particular terror of knowing you are right and knowing it may not matter. She did not sleep well. The following morning, Vance Calloway rode into town to pick up a shipment of fence wire at the feed store, which he did on the first Wednesday of every month. He tied his horse at the rail, went inside, and was loading the wire into his wagon when Edgar Price came running down the street with his hat in his hand, and his face the color of old flour. Vance looked at him without speaking, because Vance did not prompt people. He waited. "They are arresting that woman," Edgar said, breathing hard. "The one who came in on Tuesday's stage. Boyce has drawn up papers. He is going to do it this morning, right there in the square. Vance set down the spool of wire he was holding. "What charges?" he said. Edgar blinked. It was the first time in a long while that Vance had asked him a direct question about anything that was not related to feed prices or delivery schedules. "Theft," Edgar said, "and conspiracy. Boyce is saying she tried to forge land documents and that she has connections to a group of claim jumpers operating out of San Antonio." Vance looked at Edgar for a long moment with those dark, quiet eyes. "Is any of it true?" he said. Edgar looked at the ground. "No," he said very quietly. "No, it is not." Vance picked up his hat, which he had set on the wagon seat. He put it on. He turned and walked toward the square. He had not planned what happened next. He had not planned anything in 3 years, not beyond the daily work of the ranch, the fence lines, the cattle, the land, which demanded everything, and gave back in the specific honest currency of labor and weather and seasons. The ranch had been his sanctuary and his penance in equal measure, the place he had retreated to after the worst year of his life, the year that had taken his wife and his voice, and very nearly his will to be present in the world at all. He had not planned to walk into the middle of Harlan Boyce's carefully constructed trap. But his feet were carrying him there anyway, and somewhere in the back of his mind, past the grief and the silence, and the 3 years of careful not engaging with anything that was not his direct responsibility, something was awake and moving that had been still for a very long time. He knew about false land claims. He knew about Harlan Boyce's particular method of accumulating property. He knew because he had watched it happen 3 times and had said nothing, because the people it happened to were strangers to him, and because in those days, the dark days, the days after Caroline, he had had nothing left over for anyone else's trouble. He also knew, though he had not let himself think about it directly, that he had seen Vera Arden at the window of the boarding house the day she arrived, and that the way she looked out at the street, alert and cautious and quietly determined, had reminded him of something he thought he had forgotten. The specific quality of a person who was going to fight, regardless of the odds. He reached the edge of the crowd just as Boyce began reading the charges, and he heard the list of accusations, all of them fabricated, all of them designed to sound plausible enough to a crowd that did not know better and did not particularly want to. And he looked at Vera Arden standing on that platform with her wrists bound and her chin up, not crying, not begging, looking out at the crowd with those gold-brown eyes that were frightened and furious in equal measure. He pushed through the last of the crowd and stood at the foot of the steps, and for the first time in 3 years, Vance Calloway opened his mouth. "She is under my protection." The silence that followed was so complete that Vera could hear the wind moving through the cottonwood trees at the edge of the square. Harlan Boyce stared at him. The crowd stared at him. Vera stared at him. Boyce recovered first, because Boyce was a man who had been practicing recovery from inconvenient situations for most of his adult life. "Calloway," he said, in the tone of a man speaking to a troublesome animal, "this is a legal matter. You have no business here." "I have business with anything that happens in this town," Vance said. His voice was rough from disuse, rougher than he expected, like a gate that had not been opened in years, but it was steady. "And what is happening here is not legal." A murmur moved through the crowd. People looked at each other. Vance Calloway, who had not said a public word in 3 years, was speaking, and the things he was saying were the things that several people in that crowd had been thinking but had not had the courage to voice. "She came here with a valid deed," Vance continued. "The deed is on record at the county land office in Austin, not here in Austin, and it predates any claim Dale Pruitt has filed by 20 years. The charges against her are invented, Everyone here who has been paying attention knows it. Boyce's face had gone red. You want to be careful, Calloway. Interfering with a lawful arrest is a serious. Untie her hands, Vance said. The simple directness of it stopped Boyce mid-sentence. It was not a request, and it was not quite an order. It was something in between, the quiet, immovable certainty of a man who had already decided the outcome. Nothing happened for 5 very long seconds. The crowd held its breath. Then Tom Garrett, who ran the hardware store and who had been watching Harlan Boyce abuse his position for a decade while doing nothing about it, partly out of cowardice and partly out of the practical calculation that there was never anyone willing to go first, stepped forward and stood beside Vance. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, which was enough. Then Walt Ackhaffer, who drove the mail coach and was 6 feet 4 inches tall, and had no personal stake in any of this, except that he had seen Vera at the land office the day before, and had watched Edgar Price refuse to show her the records with an expression of transparent shame, stepped forward on the other side. Boyce looked at the 3 of them. He looked at his deputy, a young man named Rios who had the decency to be visibly uncertain. "This isn't over," Boyce said. But he nodded at Rios, and Rios, looking like a man who had been given an unexpected gift, went to Vera and cut the rope from her wrists. Vera stepped down from the platform. Her legs were steady, though it took effort to make them so. She walked toward Vance Calloway, and when she reached him, she stopped and looked up at him and said, with a precision and directness that matched his own, "I did not ask for help." "No," Vance said. "But you needed it." A beat of silence. "I did," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and turned to watch Boyce, who was retreating toward his office with the specific fury of a man recalculating rather than retreating, which Vance recognized as the more dangerous kind. This was not finished. It was, in fact, just beginning. But it had begun, and Vance Calloway had begun it, and he was surprised to find that the silence he had been living in for 3 years felt, suddenly, less like peace and more like a room he had been locked in without knowing the door was unlocked all along. Mrs. Holt took Vera back to the boarding house, clucking with a ferocity that was maternal in a way she would have denied, and made her sit down and drink coffee while she examined Vera's wrists, which were red and raw but not seriously damaged. Vera sat in the kitchen and drank the coffee and let herself feel the shaking that she had not allowed herself to feel on the platform. She had been genuinely afraid up there. She needed to acknowledge that to herself privately, because there was no one she trusted enough to say it aloud yet. The accusations had been so specific, so detailed, delivered with such official weight, and the crowd had been so ready to believe. Not because they were cruel, she thought, but because human beings in uncertain situations default to whatever authority figure tells them what to think, and Boyce had been presenting himself as authority in this town for a long time. What she had not expected, standing on that platform with her hands bound and her heart hammering, was the rancher. She had not expected anyone. She had been running through options, whether to shout her own defense, whether to demand they send for a federal marshal, whether to wait and look for another opportunity. When the crowd parted, and Vance Calloway walked to the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. The way he had looked at her. She kept returning to that, sitting in Mrs. Holt's kitchen with the coffee warming her hands, not like a problem to be solved, not with the particular brand of pitying rescue that reduced you to someone who needed saving. He had looked at her like someone who had made a decision and was simply here now to follow through on it. And then he had spoken, and those 6 words had rearranged the entire situation in a matter of seconds. She did not know what to do with any of this. Vance Calloway has not spoken in public since his wife died, Mrs. Holt said, settling into the chair across from her with her own coffee. 3 years ago, fever took her. It near destroyed him. Vera held this information carefully. He spoke today. He did, Mrs. Holt said. Why? Vera asked, and then felt immediately that the question was too personal, too presumptuous. Given that she did not know the man, Mrs. Holt looked at her with a small, thoughtful expression. I think, she said, that is a question you might want to ask him yourself at some point. That afternoon, Vance came to the boarding house. He knocked at the front door, hat in hand, and Mrs. Holt let him in with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been expecting this. He stood in the parlor, which was small and sunlit, with the particular careful stillness of a man who was not accustomed to parlors. Vera came downstairs and stopped at the foot of the stairs, looking at him. I want to explain the situation, he said without preamble. Boyce is not done. He will try something else. I know, she said. Will you sit down? He sat. She sat across from him. Mrs. Holt brought more coffee and then made herself absent, which was extremely pointed of her and which both of them pretended not to notice. Your deed is real, Vance said. I know that because I know which parcel you are talking about. It borders the north edge of my land. I knew your father purchased it. He passed through here once, about 20 years ago. I was a boy. My father spoke with him. The sale was legitimate. Vera stared at him. You knew my father. I knew of him, Vance said carefully. We did not know him, but my father remembered the transaction. He mentioned it to me when Prout put in his claim last year. He paused. I should have spoken then. I did not. The admission was direct and undefended, and it cost him something to make it. She could see that. He was not a man who made excuses for himself. Why did you not? She asked. The pause was longer this time. I was not, he said carefully, in a state to involve myself in other people's difficulties. I had my own to manage. She understood from the way he said it that this was true and that it was also insufficient and that he knew both things simultaneously. She respected that. And now, she said. Now you are here and the situation is in front of me, he said. I cannot look away from something that is directly in front of me. I never could. They sat with that for a moment. Boyce will try to have your deed invalidated through the local land office, Vance said, returning to practical ground in the way of a man more comfortable with facts than feelings. Though he was not as uncomfortable with feelings as he pretended to be, she thought. He has Edgar Price in his pocket, but the original deed is registered in Austin. If you write to the county land office there and request a formal record search, you can establish the priority of your claim through channels he cannot control. That takes time, Vera said. It does. 3 weeks at minimum for the correspondence. He looked at her steadily. In the meantime, you are not safe staying here in town. Boyce has people who will harass you, try to intimidate you into leaving before the records arrive. It is the method he uses. I am not leaving, Vera said. I know, he said. I am not suggesting you leave. He turned his hat in his hands once, which was the only evidence of any uncertainty. I am offering you a place to stay at the Calloway Ranch until this is resolved. You would be out of Boyce's immediate reach, and there are enough people on the property and enough history of my family in this county that even Boyce is careful about coming onto my land without cause. The offer hung in the air between them. Vera looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to understand his motive, because she had learned through a lifetime of navigating on her own that understanding motive was essential. He did not appear to want anything from her. He appeared to be a man who had decided something was unjust and was addressing it in the most practical way available to him. Why? She asked again. He met her eyes. Because it is the right thing to do, he said. And because I was not able to say that 3 years ago when I should have been, and I am trying not to make that mistake again. She thought about the boarding house, which was kind, but which was also in the middle of town, and therefore in the middle of Boyce's territory. She thought about the deed under her pillow. She thought about Dale Prute's hand on her elbow and the flat look in his eyes when she stepped away. "I accept," she said. "Thank you," he nodded. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Mrs. Holt can vouch for the propriety of the arrangement. My housekeeper, Ruth, has been with the ranch for 12 years, and it is her house as much as mine." He stood to leave and then paused at the doorway. "Miss Arden," he said, "I need to write to Austin on your behalf. Do you have the original deed?" She went upstairs and came back with it. She held it out to him. He took it gently, with the specific care of a man who understood that this piece of paper was not just a legal document but everything she had, the only thing her father had ever given her, the only foothold she had in any future she could imagine. "I will keep it safe," he said. She believed him. She was not sure why she believed him so completely and so quickly, except that there was nothing in him that she recognized as performance. He was simply what he appeared to be. That night, writing to her friend in San Antonio, a woman named Pearl who worked at a dressmaker's shop and who was the closest thing Vera had to family in the world, she described the day and found herself pausing over how to describe Vance Calloway. "Serious," she wrote finally. "Quiet. Honest in a way that I am not used to encountering in people. He has sad eyes, but they are not defeated eyes. There is a difference, and I think it is important." She sat looking at what she had written for a long time before she folded the letter. The Calloway Ranch in October was a thing of particular beauty, though Vera did not expect beauty to be what struck her first. She expected practical and functional and possibly austere, because those were the qualities she associated with the man. She did not expect the way the morning light came down across the yellow grass in long golden lanes, or the enormous cottonwood trees along the creek bed, their leaves gone amber and copper, or the house itself, not grand, not pretentious, but solid and carefully built, the kind of house that had been made by someone who intended to be somewhere for a very long time. Ruth, the housekeeper, was a broad-shouldered woman of about 50 with iron gray hair and a face like a good road. Not pretty, exactly, but reassuringly solid and well-made and clearly up to whatever was asked of it. She showed Vera to a room at the back of the house with a window that looked out over the pasture, and a quilt on the bed that had clearly been made by hand over a period of some years, each square a different pattern. "Mr. Calloway made up the room himself," Ruth said, in a tone that suggested this was unusual enough to be worth mentioning. "That was kind of him," Vera said. Ruth looked at her with a measuring expression that was not unfriendly. "You will want to stay out of town for a few days," she said. "Let Boyce think about it. He does his worst work when he is reacting fast. When he has time to think, he tends to try legal angles first, which take longer and give you more opportunity to counter." "You have watched him operate before," Vera said. "I have lived in this county for 25 years, Ruth said. "I have watched a great many things." She paused at the door. "Mr. Calloway has sent 2 letters to Austin, one to the county land office and one to a lawyer there who has dealt with contested claims before. His name is Henry Brodigan. He is competent and honest, which is not as common a combination as it ought to be." Vera sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the quilt. Each square was different. She found this tremendously moving, for reasons she did not entirely understand. Vance came to supper that first evening in clean clothes with his hair damp from washing up, and he sat at the head of the table with the quiet ease of a man in the only place in the world where he was entirely comfortable, and he asked Vera about San Antonio, which was not what she expected. She told him about the city, about the work she had done there. She had been keeping accounts for a dry goods merchant, a job she had found through Pearl, a job that paid adequately and that used the education she had cobbled together from whatever schoolrooms her intermittent childhood had made available to her. She told him about the merchant, who was fair and somewhat humorless, and about the street she had lived on, and about the plaza and the river and the way the city smelled in summer. He listened the way he seemed to do everything, completely without impatience, as though time was something he had made a separate peace with. "You have moved often," he said when she paused. "My whole life," she said. "My father was a traveling man. I grew up moving." "Is that why you want the land?" he asked, not accusatory, simply curious. She considered it. "I want something that is mine," she said. "Something that cannot be taken from me by someone's decision to move on or move away or simply disappear." She paused. "My father's letter said he bought the land to give me something rooted. He never managed to be rooted himself, but he understood that I needed it. I think it was the most honest thing he ever said to me." Vance looked at his coffee cup. "My father built this ranch on the same idea," he said. "He used to say that land was the only honest thing, because it never promised you anything except exactly what you could see from where you were standing." They sat with that for a moment, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was, if anything, companionable, the silence of two people who were discovering, somewhat cautiously, that they thought about things in similar ways. What was she like? Vera asked, and then immediately wondered if she had overstepped. Vance looked up at her. "Caroline," he said, and it was not a question. "I am sorry," Vera said. "It is not my business." "No," he said. "It is all right." He was quiet for a moment. She was kind and she was funny and she was better than this place deserved. "She died of typhoid in the summer of 1875, and it was very fast, and I was not here when it happened because I was in Abilene at the cattle auction." He said this with the flat precision of a man who had said it to himself many times, not to perform the grief but to keep it honest. "That is the part I have not entirely made my peace with." Vera did not say the things people usually said. She did not say "I am sorry" in the reflexive, conclusive way that closes off further conversation. She simply sat with him in the weight of it for a moment, and then said, "Is that why you stopped speaking in public? Because you could not bear the things people said?" He looked at her with a slight expression of surprise, as though she had identified something he had not quite articulated to himself. "Yes," he said after a pause. "People kept saying the right things in the wrong ways, and I found I had nothing to say back." He turned his coffee cup once. "I found that silence was more honest than most of the conversations I was expected to have. And today," she said. "Today it was not honest to be silent," he said simply. Ruth cleared the plates with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had heard rather more of that conversation than she was going to admit to. And the evening ended with a comfortable tiredness that was different from the exhaustion Vera had arrived with. Less the tiredness of fear, and more the tiredness of a day that had held real things in it. Over the following days, a rhythm established itself at the Callaway Ranch that Vera had not expected and did not entirely know how to account for. She was not idle. She was not the kind of person who could be idle, and after the first day of enforced rest, she began to help Ruth in the kitchen and the house, and then to help with the accounts, which Vance managed himself with a thoroughness that was admirable and a handwriting that was, charitably, difficult. He caught her frowning at his ledger the second afternoon and came to look over her shoulder and said, "I know. Your figures are correct," she said. "Your handwriting is the problem." "I am aware," he said. "I kept accounts for 3 years," she said. "I could, you are a guest," he said. "I am a person who is bored and useful," she corrected. Let me help. He looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not amusement exactly, because Vance Calloway did not do amusement obviously, but something adjacent to it, a kind of warm recognition. All right, he said. She began spending part of each morning on the accounts, and he would come in at mid-morning when the most pressing outdoor work was done, and they would go over the figures together and discuss the operations of the ranch with a directness that Vera found enormously satisfying. She had good instincts for numbers and a quick eye for inefficiencies, and he listened to her observations with genuine attention rather than the polite tolerance she had expected. There was a supply contract with a feed merchant in Waco that was losing the ranch money every quarter. She found it on the third day and showed it to him without preamble. I know, he said. Then why? The merchant is Walt Garfield. He is 60 years old and his sons have left and his wife died last winter and the contract is keeping him solvent. He looked at the numbers. I can afford the loss. She looked at him for a long moment. You are a quietly generous man, she said. He looked as though he wanted to dispute this and then thought better of it. The numbers bother you, he said instead. A little, she admitted. Make a note of it, he said, and we will revisit it in the spring when Garfield's situation may have changed. He paused. He has a daughter in Waco who may take over. She is reportedly competent. The days had a quality Vera could not immediately name, and it took her until the fourth day to identify it as safety. Not the passive safety of being left alone, but the active safety of being in a place where someone had, without drama or expectation, placed themselves between her and the thing that wanted to harm her. She had not felt this before in her adult life. It was disorienting in a way she did not expect, because it required her to relax defenses that she had been maintaining for so long that she had stopped noticing they were there. She found herself watching Vance Calloway when he did not know she was watching. She found this happening with a frequency that she could not entirely attribute to the limited social world of the ranch. She watched him working with the horses, which he did with the same complete attention he gave to everything, moving around them with a patience that they clearly trusted. She watched him at the supper table, the way he listened to Ruth and the three ranch hands, a taciturn man named Garza, a young man named Ben Cole who was about 20 and enthusiastically cheerful in a way that seemed to delight Vance in small, private ways, and an older man called Tuck who had been with the Calloway family since Vance's father's time and who spoke to Vance with the specific ease of someone who had known you when you were small. She watched him reading in the evenings, because he read every evening history, mostly, and practical books on cattle management, but also poetry, which he did not display but which she caught sight of in the book he was holding one evening when he did not hear her come into the parlor. He closed it with a neutrality that dared her to comment. "What are you reading?" she asked, a pause. "Walt Whitman," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with a slight defiance that was, she thought, extremely endearing. "I have not read him," she said. He looked at the book and then back at her, as though making a decision. Then he held it out. She sat down on the other side of the fireplace and read while he sat across from her, and the fire moved between them, and neither of them spoke, and it was one of the most pleasant evenings Vera Arden had ever spent. On the sixth day, Dale Prout rode onto the Calloway ranch with two other men. Vera was in the garden. Not gardening exactly, since the season was too late for that, but pulling the last of the dried tomato plants because Ruth had asked her to, and because physical work was preferable to waiting. She heard the horses and looked up, and the sight of Prout sitting his horse in the ranch yard hit her like a cold splash of water. Vance came out of the barn. He saw Prout and he stopped. There was a moment of assessment, rapid, quiet, thorough, and then he walked forward, not fast, not slow. Prout was smiling the same warm, false smile. "Calloway," he said, "I am just here to have a word with the young lady. This is a private matter between her and the county, and it does not need to involve you." "She is on my property," Vance said. "Everything on my property involves me." Prout's smile stayed in place with the specific effort of a man keeping a mask on. "You are making this very complicated for yourself," he said. "My uncle is patient, but he is not infinitely patient, and you have a lot to lose here." He looked deliberately at the house, the barn, the pastures, the whole of the Calloway ranch spread out around them. The implication was unmistakable. Vance looked at him for a moment with those dark, still eyes. "Get off my land," he said. "Now. And tell Harlan Boyce that if any person associated with him sets foot on Calloway Ranch again without a legal warrant, I will ride to Austin personally and file a federal complaint." "A federal complaint takes months," Prout said. "It does," Vance agreed. "And it leaves a permanent public record of everything Harlan Boyce has done in this county for the last 15 years. He paused, and the pause was deliberate. "How do you think that record reads?" Prout's smile finally failed. The flat look came back, the one Vera had seen in the feed store, but this time it was laced with something else. Something that looked, she thought, uncomfortably like genuine calculation, the kind that preceded escalation rather than retreat. He turned his horse and rode out, the two men with him following without a word. Vance turned to Vera. She was still standing in the garden with a handful of dried tomato stems, and she realized she was gripping them hard enough that the dry stalks were cutting into her palm. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He looked slightly surprised by the question, as though he had not expected it to run in that direction. "Yes," he said, "but I want you to stay close to the house for a few days." He paused. "Not because you cannot manage yourself. Because Prout is not operating alone and I cannot watch every angle of 800 acres. "I understand," she said. She looked at the dried tomato stems in her hand and then set them down. "He threatened the ranch. Boyce has tried to take smaller properties than this one," Vance said. "But not one with a 20-year county history and a clear title." He met her eyes. "He will try to pressure you into leaving and dropping the claim, which removes his problem. As long as you stay and the records come from Austin, he is exposed." "Then I am staying," she said. He nodded. And then, in what was for him an act of significant revelation, he said, "I am glad." The words were simple and direct and entirely unguarded, and they landed somewhere in Vera's chest with a warmth that she had not been expecting, and that she spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to think about, with a notable lack of success. She thought about Caroline Calloway, who had been kind and funny, and whom he had never been able to say goodbye to. She thought about what it must be like to carry that absence for 3 years in a house that she had presumably also lived in. She thought about the quilt on her bed, each square a different pattern, which Ruth had told her had been made by Vance's mother, not Caroline, which meant it had been in the house since before him. She thought about the land deed pressed between the pages of the Bible in her room. She thought about her father's letter, which she had nearly memorized by now. "I am sorry I was not the father you deserved. The land is there for you. It is the most honest thing I ever did. I hope it gives you something to stand on." She thought about standing. The response from Austin arrived 16 days after Vance's letter, which was faster than expected, and it was definitively in her favor. Henry Brodigan, the Austin lawyer Vance had contacted, had apparently moved with notable efficiency, filing a formal priority claim on Vera's behalf and attaching the original deed registration, which dated to 1858 and which superseded anything Prout or Boyce could have filed. Brodigan's letter was thorough and clear, and ended with the information that he had also notified the State Land Commissioner's office of the contested nature of the claim, which meant the issue was now visible at the state level, and any further interference from local officials would invite scrutiny that Harlan Boyce very much did not want. Ruth read the letter over Vera's shoulder and said, "That is that, then." Vance read it more slowly, standing at the kitchen table, and when he set it down there was something in his face that Vera had not seen before. A relief that was not entirely about the legal situation, she thought, but about something larger, something that had been bound up in this from the beginning in ways she was only beginning to understand. She would learn later, from Ruth, who was not indiscreet exactly, but who believed that important truths should not be kept secret from the people they concerned. That Vance had watched Boyce take the property of an elderly widow 3 years ago, 2 months after Caroline died, and had said nothing because he had been drowning in his own grief, and because he had told himself it was not his business. The widow had died the following year, far from redemption, in her daughter's house in a different county. She had never come back. Vera thought about this. She thought about what it costs to carry the weight of a silence you chose, especially when you are already carrying grief. She thought about Vance Calloway, 3 years of quiet work and a ranch that was functioning and well-run and full of small, steady kindnesses to the people around him. And she thought that he had been trying, in the way that people try when words have failed them, to live decently in the absence of the courage he had not had at the worst moment. She found him in the barn that afternoon, working on a piece of tack with the focused patience he brought to everything. She stood in the barn doorway with the sunlight behind her and watched him for a moment. "The letter from Austin," she said. "It settles everything." "Yes," he said. "I owe you a considerable debt," she said. He looked up from the tack. "You do not owe me anything," he said. "Vance." She used his first name for the first time without planning to, and they both noticed. "You wrote to Austin, you contacted a lawyer. You housed me and protected me and lost sleep over Boyce's threats to your own property, which were real threats, not hypothetical ones. The threats to my property are not your concern," he said. "They are my concern," she said, with a sharpness that was not anger but something like it, something that was about the fact that she had never had anyone put themselves between her and the world before, and she was finding the experience of it genuinely difficult to process. "Because they came from a situation that I brought to your doorstep." He set down the tack and turned to face her fully. He was not a man who looked away from direct conversations, even difficult ones. "I stepped into this situation because it was right to," he said. "Not because of anything you owe me. And the threats to my property have been coming from Boyce for years. You simply gave me a reason to stop pretending I did not see them." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" She said, for the 3rd time since they had known each other, but this time the question meant something different than it had before. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. "Because," he said carefully, "when I saw you on that platform it was like seeing someone I recognized." He paused, and the pause had effort in it. "Not literally. I had seen you twice. But the way you were standing there with your hands tied and your chin up and your eyes absolutely furious, I recognized that. The decision to be present anyway, even when it is costing you." He looked at her steadily. "I have not felt present in 3 years," he said. "I have been going through the days. And then you were standing on that platform and I was present again, and it seemed to me that the only honest response to that was to step forward." The silence in the barn was full and warm and dust moted in the afternoon light. "I am glad you did," she said. They looked at each other in the specific way of two people who have arrived at the edge of something they are both aware of and neither is quite ready to step over yet. And then Vera said, I need to go back to town and file the response to Boyce's claim formally. Will you come with me?" "Yes," he said immediately. They rode into Redemption the following morning, Vera on a chestnut mare that Vance had lent her without being asked, which she had understood as a kind of trust, and Vance on his dark horse. They rode side by side on the ranch road, and then on the main road into town, and they did not talk much, but the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need filling. Tom Garrett was in front of his hardware store when they arrived, and he nodded at them with a warm directness that made Vera understand that the public declaration Vance had made in the square had shifted something in the town, had given people permission, perhaps, to see the situation clearly, and to decide which side of it they were on. Edgar Price was behind his desk at the land office, and when Vera came through the door, he stood up immediately, which he had not done before. "Miss Arden," he said, and his voice had the specific quality of a man who had been rehearsing an apology. "I want to say, later," she said, not unkindly. "First, let us file this response." She laid Brodigan's letter and the Austin Land Office documentation on his desk. Edgar looked at it, and the relief that crossed his face was so complete and so genuine that she felt an involuntary sympathy for him. A young man in an impossible position, not evil, simply frightened, who had made the wrong choices for understandable reasons. She filed the formal response to Boyce's claim. Edgar recorded it with meticulous care, as though the precision of his recording could partially atone for the imprecision of his prior behavior. When it was done, he looked up. "Boyce is going to be angry," he said. "Yes," Vera agreed. "I should have helped you from the beginning," he said, and this time she let him say it. "You should have," she said, "but you can help now. Make sure these records are sent to Austin today and that you keep a copy here." She looked at him steadily. "If Boyce pressures you to interfere with them, you write to Mr. Brodigan in Austin and you tell him so. He will respond." Edgar nodded, with the somewhat shell-shocked expression of a person who had just been given both accountability and a path forward in the same sentence. Vance was waiting outside when she came out. He had not come in with her, which she had initially interpreted as him giving her the space to handle her own business, which was correct. But she also thought, looking at him in the sharp October sunlight, that he had stayed outside to make clear to any observer that this was her victory, her claim, her business that she was conducting on her own behalf, and that his role was support rather than primary actor. She thought this was, quietly, one of the most respectful things anyone had ever done for her. "Done," she said. "Good," he said. They walked to the feed store because Vance had his monthly wire to pick up, and while he arranged that, Vera went to the bakery, which was run by a woman named Patricia Chen, who had come out to Texas from California, and who made an extraordinary coffee cake that Mrs. Holt had mentioned. The bakery smelled like warmth and cinnamon and yeast, and Patricia Chen, who was about Vera's age and had a brisk cheerfulness that Vera liked immediately, asked about the land claim situation with frank curiosity and genuine goodwill. "This town needs more people who are not afraid of Boyce," Patricia said, wrapping the coffee cake in paper. "He has been getting worse every year." "I think he may be about to have some difficulty," Vera said. Patricia looked past her through the bakery window. Vance was crossing the street with the wire in the wagon, and Patricia's expression was warm with something that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, but was somewhere in between. "Is that Calloway?" she said. "Yes," Vera said. "He spoke for you," Patricia said. "The whole town is still talking about it." "I know," Vera said, and found that she was slightly warm in the face, which was not like her. Patricia handed her the coffee cake and said, with the directness of a woman who had decided she liked Vera, Come back and have coffee with me sometime soon. I want to hear all of it, Vera smiled. I will, she said. Harlan Boyce's response to the Austin documentation came not as a legal challenge, but as a personal visit to the Callaway Ranch, which was the least intelligent option available to him, and which told Vera and Vance both that he was operating from anger rather than strategy. He came alone, which also told them things. He rode into the ranch yard on a gray horse, and he looked, Vera thought, like a man who had slept badly, which was perhaps the first honest thing about him she had witnessed. Vance came out of the house with Vera beside him. Ruth stood in the doorway. Garza had appeared at the corner of the barn in the way that ranch hands do when something is happening, present without making himself conspicuous. Boyce looked at Vera, and then at Vance, and his jaw worked. You have made an enemy of me, he said, to Vance specifically. You made yourself my concern, Vance said quietly. That is different. I have operated in this county for 15 years, Boyce said. You have been out here on your land, staying out of things, and everyone has respected that. What you have done now, what I have done now, Vance said, is what I should have done 3 years ago and the year before that and the year before that. I am aware of that. I expect to be accounting for it for some time. Boyce's face worked through several expressions. The anger was real, she could see, but underneath it was something else, something that looked, surprisingly, like a kind of recognition, as though Vance's honesty had struck something in him that his usual operations did not usually encounter. The claim is dead, Boyce said finally. Brodigan's filing is ironclad, and you know it. Dale loses the property. He looked at Vera. You have your land. I have my land, Vera said. Boyce looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not remorse, exactly, she thought, because she was not sure Harlan Boyce was capable of remorse in the traditional sense, but a kind of awareness of consequence that was perhaps the nearest he could get to it. Prout built a house on that land, he said. He will need time to. He has 30 days, Vera said. That is more than fair. Boyce looked at her. Then he turned his horse and rode out, and nobody said anything until he was out of the gate and the dust of his horse had settled. Ruth said, from the doorway, "Coffee," with a finality that brooked no argument. They sat in the kitchen and drank it, and Vera realized that her hands were steady, which was how she knew the fear was really over. She sat across from Vance, and he sat across from her, and Ruth moved around the kitchen with her usual productive efficiency. And Ben Cole appeared in the back doorway to ask about the feed order and was told firmly by Ruth to wait. And through all of it, Vera was aware of a lightness in her chest that she had not felt in. She tried to think when she had last felt it, and could not identify the occasion. "What will you do with the land?" Vance asked. She had been thinking about this. "I want to see it first," she said. "I have not actually seen it. I have the survey description from the deed, but I have not stood on it." "It is good land," he said. "Creek runs along the east edge. It is pasture mostly. There is the house Prout built, which is small but solid." He paused. "My father's survey notes from 1858 describe it as some of the best grazing land in the county." She looked at him. "Will you take me to see it?" "Tomorrow," he said immediately. They rode to her land the next morning through the wide October air, the sky enormous and blue above the yellow grass. The parcel was about 40 acres, modest by ranching standards but substantial for a woman who had spent her adult life in rented rooms. The creek ran along the eastern edge of it, just as Vance had said, and the cottonwoods along the creek were brilliant gold in the morning light. Vera pulled her horse to a stop at the top of a small rise and looked out over all of it, and the feeling that moved through her was so large that she did not try to give it a name. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere, of a letter kept for 20 years finally being answered. Vance sat his horse beside her in silence, because he understood silence the way other men understood language, and he knew when it was needed. After a while she said, "He was trying to give me this." "Yes," Vance said. "He should have given it to me himself," she said. "He should have brought me here and shown me the creek and the cottonwoods and said, 'This is yours, this is what I built for you.'" "He should have," Vance agreed, simply and without softening. "But he sent the letter instead," she said, "and it got here eventually." She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with those dark, steady eyes that held no performance in them, no calculation, nothing except whatever was actually there, which was the most frightening and the most beautiful thing about him. "I want to stay," she said, "not just for the land. I want to stay in redemption." He looked at her without looking away. "I am glad," he said again, and this time the two words held considerably more weight than they had the first time he said them. They rode back to the ranch slowly, along the creek, letting the horses pick their way at their own pace, and they talked about the land, about what it would need, whether the house was livable, whether the grazing could support a small herd, what options she had. And underneath all of it was the awareness of something that neither of them was naming yet, but that both of them were fully aware of. Winter came to redemption in stages. First the cold nights, then the cold days, then the first hard frost that put a skin of ice on the creek each morning. Vera moved into the small house on her land in November, after Prute's 30 days were up, and the house stood empty, and she and Ruth had gone through it together, and declared it livable with work and considerably more wood for the fire. But she had supper at the Callaway Ranch 3 times a week, because Ruth cooked for a household whether or not anyone was there to eat it, and because the ranch was a 10-minute ride from her parcel, and because Vance had developed the habit of appearing in the mornings with an unnecessary but entirely welcome variety of practical assistance: a load of firewood, a better latch for the door, the information that the creek bank near the eastern edge needed shoring up before spring. She began to notice, and then to treasure, the specific texture of his attention, the way he listened when she spoke as though what she said was genuinely worth listening to, the way he disagreed with her, because he did disagree with her, regularly, on practical matters, on how to read a contract, on whether the horse she was considering buying from the Sandoval family was worth the price, directly and without condescension, treating her as someone capable of evaluating an argument on its merits. The way he was almost never warm in any demonstrative sense, and yet the warmth was everywhere in his behavior, in the firewood and the latch and the careful attention, and the books he lent her, and the way he always seemed to know when she needed the silence, and when she needed the company. She was falling in love with him, and she was aware of it with the same clarity that she was aware of everything. And she found the awareness frightening in proportion to how much she wanted it to be true. She was not inexperienced in the ways of the world, but she had not loved anyone before in the specific way that she was beginning to understand love might work. Not the dramatic and consuming and essentially self-focused feeling she had expected it to be from the novels she had read, but something quieter and more serious, something that had more to do with recognizing a person and being recognized in return. It was Tuck, of all people, who said it to her directly. She was helping him mend a section of fence on a cold December morning while Vance was in town for supplies, and Tuck worked in silence for a while, and then said, without preamble, "That boy has been in the dark for 3 years, and you have been on this property for 2 months, and he is talking again. You understand what that means." Vera kept her hands on the fence wire. "I understand what you mean," she said carefully. "He is not a complicated man," Tuck said, "in the sense that he does not play games or pretend to things. If he helps you, it is because he means to help you. If he is here every morning at your fence line, it is because he wants to be here. He hammered a staple in with the solid economy of a man who has done this 10,000 times. He has not wanted to be anywhere in 3 years. That is worth knowing. Vera was quiet for a moment. He loved his wife, she said. He did, Tuck said. She was a fine woman. She would also not have wanted him to be in the dark for the rest of his life, which he would have told you himself if he were not so stubborn about it. Vera thought about this for the rest of the day. That evening, Vance came by with the firewood that he had been bringing every few days, carrying it in from the wagon, and stacking it on the porch with the focused competence he brought to physical tasks. When he was done, he stood in the lamplight from the doorway and she stood facing him, and the cold December air was around them both, and she said, "Why do you come here every day?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I want to," he said. "Because of the land claim," she said. "That is over," he said. "Because of guilt," she said. "About the widow 3 years ago, about speaking up too late, Vera." He said her name the way he said everything, directly, without ornamentation, but it landed with a weight that stopped her. "I come here because I want to be here. Because being here is the best part of my day. Because you are honest and you are brave, and you are the most interesting person I have encountered in a very long time, and I find that I have quite a lot of things I want to say to you, which is something I have not felt in years." He paused. "That is the whole of it." She looked up at him in the lamplight and the cold air and the enormous black December sky, and she said, "I feel the same way. I wanted you to know." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences. It was the silence of two people arriving at the same place from different directions at the same time and standing there together, surprised by the fact of it. He reached out and took her hand, with a gentleness that was not tentativeness, but care, the same care he brought to everything he touched. His hand was warm against the December cold. She held it. They stood on her porch in the lamplight for a long time, not saying anything else, because nothing else needed to be said. Christmas at the Callaway Ranch was a larger affair than Vera had expected. Tuck and Garza and Ben Cole were there, and Ruth cooked for approximately 3 times the number of people present. And Patricia Chen came out from town with her husband James and their 2 small children. And Tom Garrett came with his wife Alina, who was sharp-tongued and funny, and who Vera liked enormously. And Walt Acaffer came. And Edgar Price came, with a humility that suggested he was aware this was a mercy and was grateful for it. The house was warm and the food was extraordinary, and Ben Cole had a fiddle, which nobody had mentioned to Vera beforehand, and which he played with an enthusiastic competence that resulted in dancing in the cleared front room, which resulted in Vance Callaway looking at Vera Arden with an expression of genuine helpless uncertainty, and saying, "I do not dance." "Neither do I," she said. "We can be bad at it together." They were, in fact, both perfectly adequate at dancing, which surprised them equally. They danced twice, with the careful, precise proximity of 2 people who were very aware of the distance between them, and were each second by second and entirely voluntarily choosing to reduce it. And by the second dance, there was not very much distance left, and everyone in the room pretended not to notice while noticing intensely. Afterward, when the guests had gone and Ruth had declared the cleaning a problem for the morning and gone to bed, they sat by the fire in the parlor with the last of the Christmas coffee, and Vera looked at the fire and said, "This is the best Christmas I have had in my adult life." "For me as well," Vance said. She looked at him. "That is not a high bar for either of us," she said. He made a sound that was, she had learned by now, his version of a laugh. Not the performance of amusement, but the actual thing, quiet and warm and real, which she found more satisfying than any full laugh she had encountered in other people. "No," he said, "but I mean it anyway." She set her coffee cup down and turned to face him, and he turned to face her, and they were very close, and there was a moment that held everything in it. The 3 years of his silence, the lifetime of her moving, the land that had brought her here, the platform in the square, and the 6 words that had rearranged the world. He kissed her. It was not tentative and it was not dramatic. It was what he was, present, certain, completely honest. And she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. And the fire moved in the fireplace, and the winter wind came off the prairie outside, and neither of them noticed either. Spring came in early April with the specific quality of West Texas spring. Sudden, almost violent in its insistence, the prairie going green overnight, the creek running full and cold from the north, the air smelling of earth and distance. Vance asked her to marry him on a Tuesday morning in April, standing at the fence line between his property and hers, which was the border of her 40 acres, looking out over her land in the spring light. He did it without ceremony because ceremony was not his nature and because she would have found ceremony suspect. He said, simply and directly, "I want to marry you, Vera. I want you here on this land permanently. I want to build a life with you." He paused. "If you want the same." She had been waiting for this question for approximately 3 months while trying very hard not to show that she was waiting for it. And when it arrived, what she felt was not relief or vindication or anything that had been anticipated but simply joy. The uncomplicated, unguarded, somewhat overwhelming variety. "Yes," she said. They were married in June in the small Redemption Church by a minister who had known Vance since he was a boy and who performed the ceremony with a warmth and a barely contained happiness that suggested he had been waiting for this particular occasion for some time. Patricia Chen did Vera's hair and declared the result satisfactory with the air of an artist viewing a completed work. Ruth cried with a thoroughness that she would have denied to her dying day if challenged. Tuck stood beside Vance with the solid uprightness of a man fulfilling the most important assignment he had ever been given. The whole town came. Even Edgar Price, who sat in the back and applauded with the fervent dedication of a man who understood that he was witnessing the direct consequence of something he had briefly been part of impeding, and was doing his best to make amends through enthusiasm. Vera stood at the front of the church in a dress that Pearl had sent from San Antonio, ivory muslin with small blue flowers, not elaborate, not simple, exactly right, and looked at Vance Calloway at the altar and saw exactly what she had seen on the platform 8 months ago. A man who was present, entirely and honestly present, looking at her like she was a person. He looked at her with something more than that now. He looked at her like she was the thing that had made the world make sense again, and she looked back at him with everything she was. They said their vows with a quiet directness that made the minister's eyes shine, and several people in the congregation reach for handkerchiefs. The ranch was home now in every sense of the word. Her 40 acres sat against the north edge of the Calloway property, and they ran them together from the beginning, which made practical sense and also made every morning feel like partnership in the most concrete and meaningful way. She kept the accounts for the combined operation, which Vance accepted with something that was visible relief about the handwriting situation. He managed the cattle and the land. She managed the contracts and the supply arrangements. And between them, they had the kind of working relationship that was built on genuine mutual respect, and that made the ranch run better than it ever had. They also argued. The arguments were good. They were honest. They were the opposite of the kind of silence that had surrounded Vance for 3 years, and he engaged in them with something that she recognized as genuine pleasure. The pleasure of a man who had been too long without someone to push back at him in a way that mattered. Ruth announced in November that her sister in New Mexico needed her, and that she would be leaving before Christmas, which she said with the kind of decisive firmness that suggested the announcement was a formality rather than a negotiation. She kissed Vera on the cheek before she left, which was both unprecedented and deeply felt, and told Vance that he had better be good to her, or she would come back and make his life difficult, which he received with the expression of a man who knew this was entirely true. They were good to each other, consistently, imperfectly, honestly. In the spring of 1880, their son was born. They named him Robert, for Vera's father, and because Vance said that the name deserved to be associated with better things than it had been, which made Vera cry in the specific way that she only cried when something was true in a way that surprised her. Robert Calloway arrived in the world at dawn on a March morning, loudly and emphatically, which made both his parents laugh even through the exhaustion and the relief. He had Vance's dark eyes and Vera's gold-brown coloring, and a set of opinions about his situation that he expressed with tremendous force from the first hours. He was, in short, exactly what both of them would have designed if they had been given the option. Tuck, who had been waiting on the porch all night with what he described as entirely ordinary occupational concern, came in and held the baby with the careful reverence of a man holding something extremely valuable, and said nothing, which was eloquent. Ben Cole, who was 22 by this point and had recently proposed to the daughter of the Sandoval family, came by with enough food to feed the whole county and the fiddle, which Vera requested he not play for at least another month. Patricia Chen came with her husband James and their 3 children now, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Vera with the baby and said, "You look like someone who has figured out where she is going," which was the best thing anyone had ever said to Vera Arden Calloway. "I have," Vera said. Harlan Boyce, it turned out, had a reckoning coming from a direction none of them had anticipated. The State Land Commissioner's office, having been notified of the Arden claim situation by Brodigan, had sent an investigator to Redemption in the fall of 1879, and the investigator had found what a careful person looking for it would find: a pattern of falsified documents, a clerk who had been coerced, 3 prior property transfers that did not bear examination. Boyce resigned from the sheriff's position in January of 1880 before charges could be formally filed, and left the county. Dale Prout followed him, having no reason to stay. Edgar Price was kept on probationally, and by all accounts worked with a thoroughness born of gratitude and contrition that served the county well. The town of Redemption elected a new sheriff, a measured and honest man named Samuel Acosta, who had ranched in the county for 10 years, and who was generally regarded as the kind of person the job required. He and Vance had a long conversation over coffee the week after the election, the kind of conversation that was about the future of the county and what it needed to become, and Vera sat at the table and contributed to it with the directness and practical intelligence that she brought to everything. And Samuel Acosta left the ranch looking thoughtful in a productive way. 2 years after Robert came a daughter, Clara Jane, named for Mrs. Holt, who had moved to her daughter's house in Dallas but who received a letter about it and wrote back in a hand that was shaking slightly with emotion. Clara was quieter than her brother but more relentlessly observant, sitting in the middle of whatever room she was in and watching everything with those gold-brown eyes with an intensity that made people feel that they had been carefully assessed and tentatively approved. The ranch grew. Not dramatically, not through any gamble or ambition beyond the honest work of good management and good land, but steadily, year over year, through careful decisions and fair dealing, and the particular quality of a place that was run by people who cared about it as a living thing rather than a financial calculation. The cattle herd expanded. The fence lines were maintained. The feed store contract with Garfield's daughter, who was, indeed, competent and who also turned out to be sharply funny and who became one of Vera's closer friends, became one of the best deals in the county. Vera's 40 acres remained hers. She kept the deed in a new frame on the wall of the study, the original document in its century-old ink, because she wanted to look at it. She wanted Robert and Clara to grow up looking at it and understanding what it meant. Not just property, not just inheritance, but a letter that arrived eventually. A thing that was given late and imperfectly, but given nonetheless. And that had brought her here, to this man and this land and this life that was more rooted than anything she had known how to want when she was young and moving and afraid to stop. Vance told her, one evening in December when Robert was nearly 3 and Clara was in her first months, and they were sitting by the fire after the children were asleep, that he had not believed it was possible to be this fortunate. He said it quietly, in the way he said everything, without any performance of it, and she looked at him across the fire with 4 years of marriage and a ranch and 2 children, and the particular deep knowledge of a person you have argued with and worked beside and slept beside and been honest with in every direction, and she said, "Believe it." He looked at her with those dark, honest eyes, and he did. The cottonwoods along the creek of Vera's 40 acres grew taller every year. In autumn, when their leaves turned amber and copper and fell into the cold running water, she would sometimes ride out there alone in the early morning before the household was awake, and stand at the top of the small rise where she had stood the first time Vance had brought her here, and look out over the land. She would think about her father, who had stood somewhere on this land in 1858 with his young man's hope and his restless soul, and had bought a piece of it, not for himself, because he had never managed to be still enough to claim anything for himself, but for the idea of her, the daughter he had not yet learned how to know, who would come here someday, he hoped, and find something to stand on. She had found it. She had found it and more than it. She had found the man who stepped forward in a crowded square with 6 words and a 3-year silence behind them, and changed the direction of her life by being the first person in a very long time who looked at her and saw exactly what was there. She would stand on the rise by the Cottonwood Creek and feel the wind come down off the prairie, which was the most honest thing in the world, and she would feel it against her face and think, here is where I am going, here is where I am. And then she would ride back to the ranch and go inside, where the fire was going and the coffee was on and Vance was at the table with the accounts, or at the window watching the morning come over the pasture. And he would turn when she came in, the way he always turned when she came in, as though her arrival was a thing worth turning for. And she was home,